The Andy Pollin Show.
We got to go after this with everything we got, figuring they're going to come with everything they got.
I'll start off by saying I'm bored, I'm broke, and I'm back.
The Andy Pollin Show on ESPN 630 starts right now.
Yeah, temperatures was in the 50s. Temperatures were. I say temperatures is? Temperatures were in the 50s when you stepped outside your front door today, and we're supposedly in the dog days of August. Typically in Washington, these are brutal days, but it's been wonderful the last few days. A little warmer today, but only the low 80s, and I don't know if we can sustain until we get into fall and the leaves start to change, but I'll certainly take this over what we had in July. The stifling heat, over 100 degrees, yikes. So all is good. 65 years ago today, an enormous move for professional football. We'll get to that in the next hour. There's also some news to report on the Commanders, some breaking news within the last hour, and I guess this qualifies as breaking news. They're bringing in another kicker. This has been a very difficult situation for them since they decided not to bring back Joey Sly, and they signed Brandon McManus, veteran kicker from the Jacksonville Jaguars, and then it was reported that a civil suit had been filed by two flight attendants who say they were sexually harassed by McManus on a team flight, Jacksonville going to London, which they do every year. And because of the history of this team, the recent history, and what happened with the exit of Dan Snyder, you just couldn't keep somebody like that around. So they've been trying various kickers, and it does not look like right now that Patterson is going to work out. He's already missed 3 field goals during the preseason, Riley Patterson. So they have made a move today, and they traded a conditional 7th-round pick to the Cleveland Browns to bring in Cade York. Cade York kicked at LSU. I don't know if he overlapped Jaden Daniels or not. He came out for the 2022 draft, and he was a high draft pick for a kicker, 4th round. You don't usually see kickers taken that high, and had a pretty decent year for Cleveland in 2022. He had 75% of his field goals, 94.6% of his extra points. But he was beaten out last year by Dustin Hopkins. Remember Dustin Hopkins? He was here, probably never should have been cut, but Ron Rivera wanted to make a statement after a loss and decided to cut him loose. He also, may have cost them the playoffs during the 2016 season when he missed a chip shot in London, and they wound up settling for a tie. I believe it was against Cincinnati in that game. And so they've been, looking for kickers. And my buddy Al Galdi laid this all out in a tweet earlier today. He said Cade York in Cleveland was replaced by Dustin Hopkins, who in Washington was replaced by Chris Blewett, who was replaced by Joey Sly, who in Carolina replaced Graham Gano, who in Washington was replaced by Billy Cundiff, and then Kai Forbath, who was replaced by Dustin Hopkins. And that's, pretty typical of the way kickers work, although once you find one, you probably should hang on to him. And if they'd have been smarter, they would have held on to Dustin Hopkins, and he would still be the kicker. But the hope is that Cade York can win the job. They didn't risk much. It's a conditional 7th-round pick, meaning that if he beats out Riley Patterson, the 7th rounder would go to Cleveland, and if they wind up cutting him, I don't think they would owe Cleveland anything. And Cleveland, was ready anyway because Hopkins was really good last year. He's a veteran, and they feel confident with him this year. So there's your kicking situation. What I think is going to happen, there's no reason to make any, I don't know what they're going to do in a roster move to make room for York, but there's probably somebody that's going to be released anyway when they get down to the 53-man roster on, I think it's Tuesday or Monday of next week. So that should be a pretty easy move. But I would think that both Patterson and York will kick in the preseason finale, which is Sunday night against New England, and they'll make a decision after that. I would think that unless York is terrible, that he's going to win the job. I think, they're going to want to have a guy who's a veteran. He did a pretty good job with the Browns a couple of years ago. Bounced to a couple of practice squads last year. He was with Tennessee and the Giants, and then Cleveland brought him back in this year, which is kind of a surprise because Hopkins was good last year. Oftentimes over the years when Washington hasn't needed a kicker, they didn't bring anybody else in to to compete with them. I'm kind of surprised they made that move. But anyway, Cade York goes to Washington. Mr. York goes to Washington. Meantime, yak yesterday from Dan Quinn. They are operating more or less on a regular week, where they have Monday meetings and treatment for players and maybe a little walkthrough, and Tuesday's a day off, and then you start practicing again on Wednesday. Now, they're not installing any game plan or anything like that, and who knows who's going to play what when they take on New England. It's still up in the air whether Jaden Daniels is going to get any snaps, but they have to go through this, and they will, I guess, make some decisions on a few guys who are on the bubble. They probably, in their heads, pretty much have the 53-man roster in place, what they're going to do. But, I guess there's a couple of last-minute decisions that they have to make. And this was Quinn yesterday on what this week means to him as a head coach.
I actually do enjoy this week. It's a tricky one because emotions are at different spaces, and it's one of the more challenging ones as a coach. Some may know, hey, I'm not going to play a lot in this game. Others may know, hey, this is my real chance to go do my thing and show these, this organization, one last time what I'm about. So it's tricky, but I also love it because as you go through it and it gets into the really hard moments in the game, you really find out like who's about it. And so I saw some of that in Miami on the sideline of when it got, really tough, who was really ready to smile and keep saying, hey, bring some more on. And so those are the moments this week and last week that I look for, and they just kind of reveal themselves through the week and especially in the games.
All right. One guy he does not have to worry about, and I would be surprised if he plays at all, and that's Bobby Wagner. Bobby Wagner, to me, and I'm older, this is probably going to be too old for you unless you're probably 60 plus. But in 1971, when George Allen got here and brought in the over-the-hill gang, a lot of players who had played for him either in Chicago or Los Angeles or in some cases both, he brought in Jack Pardee. Jack Pardee had been his top linebacker with the Los Angeles Rams. He was the leader on the field. He called the signals. Pardee went on to a long coaching career both in college and in the NFL and coached here for 3 years. Matter of fact, he replaced George Allen when Allen left after the 77 season. So I have made these comparisons between Jack Pardee and Bobby Wagner. I don't know if it's going to work out the same, but it just seems to me that for Quinn, Bobby Wagner is what Jack Pardee was for George Allen. He's got such incredible faith in him. He's going to call the defensive signals. He's going to set the tone for the defense. And Pardee only played here for 2 years, but he was terrific. He got them to the playoffs in the 71 season, or helped to get them there. And then in 72, they went to the Super Bowl. Now, one of the images of him is trying to chase down Larry Zonka, who was running like a bull on the loose and had trouble bringing him down, and that was the last game of his career. But I thought he made a huge contribution here. As a matter of fact, when I was on the committee to select the 70 greatest players of all time in franchise history, I wanted to put him on it. But Bobby Mitchell said something to me. He said he didn't like Pardee, so that kind of turned the tide. But I thought he did a great job. So Wagner, I think, is what who Quinn is looking at that can make that kind of contribution. And when asked about Wagner yesterday, Quinn couldn't say enough good things.
What a remarkable competitor he is, and I think that was probably one of the first things that I remember. Way back of meeting him, I was in Seattle 2 different times, and it was one of the spaces in between that the team drafted him, so I got to start maybe when his second year with him. And just the details that he would go to, the willingness to get it right, and he was just always so consistent. Even as a second-year player, you may have thought he had already been in the league 4 or 5 years. So he had this consistency and professionalism about him that showed people they could really rely on him very early. And now you see that he's sharing that information, with others. And if you were to sit in the linebacker room, you would see them asking him, or what is that process like? Just the smallest of the details. So what I have seen is just he's a remarkable tackler. He's got instincts, but all the really good linebackers who are good tacklers, or safeties for that matter, can play square. And if you're watching the film of Wags, you rarely see him out of position, and he plays square, and he's a sure tackler, but just it's the angles, the tracking. It's like, probably watching, like in basketball, a good shooter, or in baseball, a good hitter. He is a remarkable tackler, and he takes the right angles, the right tracks to go to it. And so he's always been somebody that I look for in that example.
That answer about a minute and a half. That probably tells you all you need to know about the relationship between Dan Quinn and Bobby Wagner. Bobby Wagner is going to be the coach on the field for the defense, and he's still got some skills. He led the league in tackles last year. He may be 34 years old. He may have had the bulk of his career already, but if he's got a few years left, that's going to be huge for the defense. I guess I'm wrong about the kicker. I just saw this. The team has announced that they have released Riley Patterson. So it looks like, unless he's absolutely terrible, Cade York, terrible in this last preseason game, is going to be the kicker going into the season. Now, they would have another week if he doesn't perform well to bring somebody else in. But, they have released Patterson. Now, they have not announced the signing of York yet. That's still being reported. But they signed another safety, Sheldrick Redwine, who I'm not familiar with, but they'll probably have to make another roster move once they add Cade York, once, I guess, all the paperwork goes through and they get that done. So bye-bye Riley Patterson. That's now 3 different kickers that they have gone through since last season when they decided that they weren't bringing back Joey Sly. So right now, your only kicker in camp today and tomorrow and then going into the game will be Cade York, who was once a 4th-round pick by the Cleveland Browns out of LSU, kicked for them for 1 year, bounced around a couple of practice squads last year, and was beaten out this year by Dustin Hopkins, who had a pretty long run here. All right, one more thing from Quinn, and that is the quarterback position, and you know that he has officially named Jaden Daniels as the starter. But as good as Daniels has been and as much confidence as they've shown in him, Quinn is realistic about how the growing curve is going to go this season.
Anytime there's development, there's, marks that you go up and down. And so not just, related to quarterback, but we're kind of growing, things we saw better from, preseason 1 into preseason 2 and again for this week. So it's kind of part of that process. So I would say that is one area I'm not as impatient, because I expect those to take place. So you may hear me use the term expect the expected. There's going to be bumps. There's going to be missed turns that you need. And quite honestly, you don't want them to, but you know that it's an important part of the process.
So that's Quinn on what he expects this year from Daniels. There's going to be some growing pains, no question about it. Both or 2 of our best columnists in town wrote columns today about Jaden Daniels becoming the starting quarterback. Barry Zerluga, he did something funny. He went back to his notes from 2012 and looked at the quotes from Mike Shanahan and RG3 about his debut and the dawn of that era after RG3, like Daniels, was the number 2 pick of the draft after winning the Heisman Trophy, and what was being said and the similar things that are being said now. I was confident at the time with RG3, but having seen how that played out, I feel much better about the Jaden Daniels situation. He's clearly more humble. He's not just a straight line runner like RG3. RG3 was a hurdler. Probably never should have been a football player. Should have been an Olympian. Whereas Daniels has some more moves to him and pretty much has a better handle on things as a human being, it seems, than RG3, about how he's perceived, about how his teammates perceive him, so forth and so on. So what Tom writes in his column, and I disagree with him a little bit on this. He talks about how they name Daniels the starter and how cool everybody thinks it is, and he said, what would not have been cool was the alternative. That would have been a disaster right out of the box, more of a disaster than having to cut the place kicker you signed in March when you discovered he was accused of sexually assaulting 2 women on a plane last season and still searching for a new kicker 2 weeks before the season starts. Well, now it looks like they have found their kicker as they make a trade with the Cleveland Browns. But that was going into yesterday. He says if Daniels' last year's Heisman Trophy winner with 55 college games of experience at Arizona State and LSU was not the Commanders' starter for the opening game September 8th in Tampa, that would have qualified as a disastrous start for Peters and Quinn, who as leaders of this new band at Commanders Park have seemed to hit most of the right notes so far. I don't know about that. I wonder. I don't think it would have been a disaster. I think they said all along that they were going to make the move at the right time. There'd be a lot of people going, wow, number 2 pick of the draft, 55 college starts. But I don't think it would have qualified as a disaster if he was not named the starter going into the opening game. Another thing that's a factor in this, I think, is that Mariota couldn't play in the last game. He had a hamstring injury, and if he was terrific against the Dolphins, I don't know if that would have played a factor, but that kind of took the bat out of their hands. In many ways, Daniels being healthy is a big factor in this. He also points out that Quinn did not name him a team leader. Remember, we went through some of that tape from earlier this week where, he was asked about him being a leader. He says he didn't necessarily want him to be a leader at this point, just wanted him to learn how to play quarterback. And Quinn said, it'll come in time, but I didn't want to add extra onto him when we selected him. I just wanted him to be the best version of him right away, but he didn't have to take on more than was required. And Lavero writes, I'm not sure who Quinn is talking to here. I would assume that Daniels will not be a team captain, which would seem to add that extra weight. By the nature of the position, Daniels' teammates will expect him to be a leader on the field. I think that's fair. He also says the coach's comments may be for the benefit of the fans who are desperate not just for a leader, but for a savior to lead this franchise out of the grave. The expectations among those fans in the DMV are understandably high, and the brief moments that we've seen Daniels in the preseason, he has done nothing to diminish those expectations. But the outside view is not as enthusiastic. Vegas has the Commanders over-under at 6.5 wins. The Athletic published an NFC projection model that has Washington's win total at 5.9. So, I think it's possible they win between 7 and 9 games. I would take the over on that at this point. But with a rookie quarterback and the bumps that you will have along the way, you never know. Is this going to wind up being a C.J. Stroud Houston situation? Maybe, maybe not. And even if it's not, I don't think you write this off as a disaster this year. This is going to be a year where you're going to find out a lot about your team, not just your quarterback. And I think that you have to have quite a bit of patience on this. But I think 7 and 9 wins is in play, and if you win 9, you're in the mix for a wild card. So you never know how that's going to work out. Al Attles has passed away. It may be too long for you to remember what Al Attles was all about as a player and as a coach. Well, let me refresh your memory with something local, which we'll get to next. It's the Andy Pollin Show, ESPN 630.
The Andy Pollin Show on ESPN 630, the sports capital.
65 years ago today, the formation of the American Football League. Lamar Hunt was the mover and shaker on that and how it changed sports dramatically. We'll get to that in an hour. Al Attles passed away yesterday at the age of 87, and he spent his entire professional career with the Warriors, first as the Philadelphia Warriors, then the San Francisco Warriors, and now the Golden State Warriors. He was drafted out of an HBCU, historically black college, which was North Carolina A&T, by the Philadelphia Warriors in 1960. And as part of that team, he played a season later with Wilt Chamberlain in the famous 100-point game by Wilt, where Wilt scored 100 and Al Attles scored 17, which was double his career average. He averaged 8.9 points a game, 3.5 rebounds, and 3.5 assists. So he's not a Hall of Fame player, but he had a Hall of Fame basketball career with the Warriors because he became a coach and later the general manager of the team, and later an ambassador for the team. He was the face of the franchise, and most importantly for Al Attles was winning the 1975 championship as a coach. Now, they had Rick Barry, and they had a bunch of really good complementary players. They had I think he was still going by Keith Wilkes at the time. He had been drafted out of UCLA, part of the Bill Walton gang there, and some good complementary players. But Rick Barry was the star. And what Al Attles did, and this is how they wound up sweeping the Bullets, is he went 9 deep. He basically wore them out, because if you look at all 4 games of the series, the Bullets got the lead in every one of them. And the Bullets were heavily favored going into this. They had won 60 games. And I think if you look at that team top to bottom, it may have been better than the one that won the championship in 1978. But things just fell apart for them in those finals. And I think part of the reason was they had a guard that they had taken from the NBA, Jimmy Jones. And Jimmy Jones was the 3rd guard on that team. He was like the 6th man, and he was a very important part of their rotation. And during the playoffs, he hurt his knee and was out for the finals, didn't play. They had beaten Philadelphia. They had beaten Boston, the defending champs, to get there. And after a 60-win season, were favored against a Warriors team which had to go 7 games and had to go overtime to beat the Chicago Bulls to get there. So here were the well-rested Bullets with home court. And it was crazy the way home court worked that year, because there was a conflict with where the Warriors played. And I think the second arena was called the Cow Palace, was also not available. So what they did was they said to the Bullets, hey, you can play the way things are working out. We can play the first 2 games at home in Golden State, in Oakland, and then you get 3 at home. They said, no, we got to open at home. So they opened the series at home, went and played 2 at the Cow Palace, and then came home for Game 4, which they lost and were swept. And that Rick Barry team, and he was tremendous during those finals, that's a team that's probably underrated for all time. But one thing about Attles, he's 6 feet tall, was 6 feet tall, and was the toughest person that anybody had ever seen in the NBA. He's very good friends with Wilt Chamberlain, but I think when they played on separate teams, when Wilt went to Philadelphia or back to Philadelphia with the 76ers, I think Attles took him on. I mean, he was a tough dude. And so in Game 4 between the Bullets and the Warriors in 75, the Bullets were getting desperate. And Mike Reardon, God love him, gave him everything he had, but he's guarding Rick Barry, who's a Hall of Fame player, and Barry's lighting him up in the 3 games. So they get an early lead in Game 4, and I think Reardon figured, hey, if we can get Barry out of this game, if I can pick a fight with him, and maybe I get thrown out too, we get him out of the game, and maybe we have a chance to win. So there's a clear, what they would call now a flagrant foul, probably a flagrant 2. It was not a basketball play. Barry came around a pick from Clifford Ray, and Reardon chased him and grabbed him over the shoulder behind the back, which touched off this. This was Brent Musburger, along with Oscar Robertson, calling this in 1975 on CBS.
Washington looking much more aggressive here in the early going. They lead it by 4 points, and here is Clifford Ray. Sets a pick for Rick Barry. Barry looking for some shooting room. Reardon is on him. Now hold on, Attles has come out at Reardon. Coach Al Attles wants Reardon. Unsel's got Attles. He's pushing him back. Attles one on him. Reardon was all over Rick Barry. Attles is furious. Now Bill Bridges has a hold of Unseld. He's trying to push West back. Joe Roberts grabs Attles, yanks him back out of the way.
Well, I tell you, this is a man's game. They're down 3-0. This way it's getting a little rough out there.
Coach Al Attles came right out after Reardon.
And he didn't care that Wes was in his way. Wes, one of the strongest men ever to play basketball, 6'7", 250 pounds of muscle. And here's Al Attles, 6 feet tall. He's getting older. I guess he's pushing 40 at that point. Let's see. Let's do the math. 1975 was 49 years ago, and he died at 87. This is his late 30s, and he's removed as a player for a number of years, and he's going to take on Wes Unseld so he can get to Mike Reardon and tear his face off. That's how Al Attles was. He was a tough guy. He wound up getting a second technical for jawing at the referees. He got thrown out of the game, but the Warriors won anyway. And that series was historic. 1975. Realize the first African-American coach in any sport was Bill Russell in 1966 with the Boston Celtics, but he was a player coach. Lenny Wilkins also, I believe, did that for Portland at some point. But in 1975, Casey Jones was coaching the Bullets, and Al Attles was coaching Golden State. It was the first time the two African-American coaches met to decide a championship. And, you think about when that happened in football, which would have been, I believe, 2010. So it's another 35 years before it's Tony Dungy going up against Lovie Smith. And football didn't even have its first black coach until Art Shell got the job with the Raiders in 1989. So, you look at the life that Attles had, starting, going to an historically black college, making the Warriors as a fifth-round pick at a time where there were supposedly quotas on the number of African Americans you could have on one team. They already had Wilt Chamberlain, and he made the team. That's how tough he was, and had a great playing career for them, a coaching career which he won a championship, and then worked as a GM and in the front office for that team for a long, long time. So rest in peace, Al Attles, as tough a guy as there ever was in the NBA. Coming up, Ian O'Connor with his new book out about Aaron Rodgers making the tour. Showed up on the Dan Patrick Show yesterday with a couple of interesting nuggets on whether you like him or not, a very fascinating figure in Aaron Rodgers. It's the Andy Pollin Show, ESPN 630.
The Andy Pollin Show on ESPN 630, the sports capital.
65 years ago today, the launch of the American Football League, how that came about and the impact that it had not just on football, but the entire sports world. We'll get to that in about 20 minutes. Meantime, Ian O'Connor, who has written a book about Aaron Rodgers, is making the rounds on the various talk shows, was on the Dan Patrick Show yesterday, and we still don't know. We're doing this again with Rodgers. Will he play in the exhibition finale or won't he? He's going to be back on Monday Night Football, where his season lasted 4 plays last year. They're playing at San Francisco, the area where he grew up, the Bay Area. And it's take 2 on what was that a hype thing last year? And it's hyped again. And O'Connor, who is based in New York, saw the hype and decided that he was going to write a book about Aaron Rodgers, an unauthorized biography. So what that means is he talked to many, many people associated with Aaron Rodgers, and he did not necessarily get the cooperation for Rodgers. He put out the feeler, would you talk to me about the book? Didn't hear anything. So he actually wrote the book, talked to 250 people, sent the pages to Rodgers to read, and Rodgers responded that he would talk to him. So O'Connor flew out to California and spent about 2 hours talking to Aaron Rodgers and confirmed some things that he heard, maybe got some pushback on a few things, added some quotes, and the book came together. So it's an unauthorized biography of Aaron Rodgers, but it does include some cooperation in the book. And when he was on with Dan Patrick yesterday, Patrick asked him about Rodgers and the spotlight and whether or not he actually seeks it out.
I think he wants to be talked about. I think he always has. And I think he leans into it now. Back in August of 21, those 4 words, "Yeah, I've been immunized," that turned him into a villain. Before then, he was considered one of the more socially aware athletes in sports. He was celebrated by the same journalists who then turned on him after the truth came out about his unvaccinated status. And I think after that, he decided to really dig in. And if the media wanted to go to war with him, he would be a willing participant in that war. But I think at the end of the day, he likes creating news cycles. He can do it just rolling out of bed. I've rarely seen an athlete who could command the spotlight the way he can. It's amazing that here we have a Kansas City and Patrick Mahomes going for a three-peat, and Aaron Rodgers, who hasn't been to the Super Bowl in a long time, is still by far the most talked about person in the league. And that's really a major reason why I decided to do this book.
Does he care what the public thinks of him?
He's human, so he cares. He does. And he's admitted to me, at least in one answer, that it does hurt when he gets criticized. But he's a fearless public speaker. I do, on a certain level, give him a lot of credit for that, because I'm not, and I think most people aren't. And he's willing to sometimes, unfortunately, defend indefensible positions on things. But I think the criticism has hurt him. And I think he was hurt after those 4 words, yeah, I've been immunized, when he felt that he had some media allies who weren't there for him. He thought he would get some support and some of those allies would rush to his side, and that did not happen. So, yeah, he bleeds too. And I think that he tries to do a good job of not showing that, but it's there.
Yeah, and look, he was snarky about the whole thing, so I understand that. Also, yeah, I mean, he was going to be, well, he wasn't going to be, but discussing the idea of being Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s running mate. Kennedy's supposed to drop out of the race tomorrow and join the Trump team, but come on. I mean, really, those are things that make him, in the spotlight, but not for the reasons you would think for a Hall of Fame quarterback. With what happened last year, with the season lasting 4 plays for him and the expectations that went out the window quickly, this was a question that Patrick had put to Ian O'Connor about maybe a do-over for the Jets and or Aaron Rodgers.
No, I think Aaron would still do it. I think the Jets would still do it. Of course, after this season, if they have a losing season or he's hurt again, I think the answer would be different. But Aaron was no longer wanted in Green Bay. He knew that. Effectively, that was a firing, even though he pushed for the trade. He saw this great opportunity, Dan, in New York, to, if he wins a ring for a franchise in the big city that has not been to the Super Bowl since January of '69, that's going to feel like 3 rings. And it's going to be Messier in '94 for the Rangers on steroids. And I think looking at Brady with 7 rings and Aaron with 1, he can't close that gap. But if he wins the big one for the Jets, it's going to feel like he really did close that gap. And I think he saw that as a great opportunity. And I agree with him.
I wonder about his career, how he views it, because he's often referred to as the most talented quarterback, or maybe the 1 or 2 most talented quarterbacks to ever play the game, but he has 1 Super Bowl. Has it been a disappointment to him in what he's accomplished, even though he's been league MVP quite a few times?
And I think the league MVPs helps a little bit, and he did win more of those than Tom Brady, but that's not what people count. They count the rings, and he's down 6 to the guy he will always be compared against, and that hurts. But he didn't have Belichick, arguably the greatest coach of all time. He didn't have Josh McDaniels, the best offensive coordinator in the league, and he didn't have that Patriot Way support system. There are people who believe that Aaron would have won 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 rings with the Patriots in the same situation Brady was in. Special teams and defense and coaching were factors in some of those bitter playoff defeats. If you look at particularly the period, Dan, from 2013 through 16, those 4 seasons of lost postseason opportunities, Aaron made big, sometimes magical, sudden death plays in each of those seasons, and there's nothing but failure in the box score. So I do think his 11-10 postseason record can be a little misleading, but at the end of the day, he's barely over 500 in the playoffs, and he can't really run away from that.
Let me go back to you saying that he got fired by the Packers. Did he get himself fired? Like, it's one thing that, the franchise is going to turn on you, but it felt like they were at a point of no return, that they had to do that.
Well, it was a very similar situation to Brett Favre, ironically enough. And Aaron was on the good side of that one, and now on the bad side of the franchise wanting to turn it over to Jordan Love. And I think that they always had, later in his career, the upside and the downside of employing Aaron Rodgers. But the downside got greater in that you had him. He wanted more personnel say and influence in decisions, and that's not really the Packer way. I think they gave him a little bit more late in his career, but not enough. And then suddenly he's not making the playoffs. That last year, he looked like a diminished player, misses the playoffs, so we're not getting the upside. When Aaron's healthy, we're getting in the playoffs basically every year. So they wanted to move on. He knew that. And again, with the Jets, it was a great opportunity. Hey, go to the big city. I'm coming from the smallest market in the NFL. Let me go to the biggest and try to pull off something that would be pretty iconic. And so it was, both parties knew they had to have this divorce, but deep down, he's hurt by that. And people close to him told me that. And So ideally, if he could reach the Super Bowl, I think the team he would want to face and beat is the Green Bay Packers for obvious reasons.
Oh, yeah. Whew, would that be hyped? Aaron Rodgers versus the Green Bay Packers playing for the New York Jets, who not only haven't won a Super Bowl since 1969, they haven't been in a Super Bowl since 69. And you talk about legacy. Think about Joe Namath, who played in 2 playoff games his entire career. He beat the Raiders in the AFC Championship game. That was the only playoff game that year in the AFL. It was the second to last year of the AFL. And then famously beat the Baltimore Colts in the Super Bowl. That's it. He had more interceptions than touchdowns during his career. His passing numbers would never put him close to the Hall of Fame. But winning that game has made him iconic, for a variety of reasons, more than just winning and pulling what was considered to be one of the biggest upsets, and at the time, prior to the U.S. Olympic hockey team beating Russia, the biggest upset in sports, because the Jets were 18-point underdogs, and you had this image of Namath, the playboy, New York City, the big contract that he got from Alabama. I mean, this was just enormous. And 55 years later, he's still dining out off of that, to the point now where he advertises Medicare supplements and hearing aids on TV. Well, that's how long it's been. But he's still Joe Namath. And I think that Aaron Rodgers, that's a very good point that O'Connor makes, that winning a Super Bowl with this franchise, it's not the city. If he goes to New York and he wins a Super Bowl, well, they've had them. Phil Simms has won them. Eli Manning has won them recently, relatively recently. So if he wins one for the Giants, yeah, he would be celebrated. But the Jets would be something else. And it does make a lot of sense. So, and again, the Packers were ready to move on, and they were getting tired of his shenanigans anyway. And he, didn't make the playoffs his last year anyway. And they had to make a decision after 3 years on Jordan Love. They weren't going to say, well, this is a disaster and kick it down the road. No, they realized he was ready to play. He is ready to play. And looks like he's going to be one of those elite quarterbacks. So they're 3 for 3 in the way they've done things. So, yeah, going to the Jets made a lot of sense for Aaron Rodgers. One other thing from Ian O'Connor, and he's got this new unauthorized biography out about Rodgers. What is going to be next for him after he finishes playing football?
I think he'll be one of the best analysts in a network booth ever. And I know he says he doesn't really have interest in that, but when he's talking football, there's nobody like him. I think he's even better at it, or would be, than Brady and Peyton Manning. He's a computer. When he's talking football, it's mesmerizing, and I think he would be unbelievable at it. And I don't see another path for him. I don't think politics is the answer. I think he'll stay in football, and that seems to be the natural second career for him.
Well, keep an eye on how it goes for Brady this year. If Brady really likes this, and I have my doubts, because it's a grind. You're going from city to city. You can't just fly in the day of the game, do the game, and go home. I've heard that that's in play. I don't think it's going to work that way. And there have been Hall of Fame quarterbacks who've turned it down. Steve Young could have done that. Didn't want to put in the time. And then Peyton Manning figured out the whole thing where he and his brother can sit on their couch and do the Manning cast and be great at it. So I would think Rodgers might move to something like that. That seems like the way TV is going. But, who knows? Maybe he will be a booth analyst, and maybe he will be for, Fox has now Brady. CBS has Romo. Could he be the NBC guy when they get rid of Chris Collinsworth? Does it work that way? Who knows? Or does he go, the next step, Amazon? Could he be the one that steps in there? There's a lot of possibilities, but I just have my doubts that he's going to go week to week and be an analyst. Meantime, let's see if he wins the Super Bowl. And if he wins the Super Bowl for the Jets, I think all bets are off. Then who knows how big he could be? Maybe he does run for office or runs for mayor of New York. Who knows? We'll see. A couple of college football stories, and this is just it just makes my head spin, the state of college football today, and these two stories are evidence of this. Iowa coach Kirk Ferentz, who's been there forever, he's been there since 1999, 25 years on the job, and his assistant coach, John Budmar, will be suspended for a violation related to the recruitment of transfer quarterback Cade McNamara. Used to play at Michigan and lost his job to J.J. McCarthy after he got hurt, and then transferred to Iowa. So both Ferentz and assistant coach John Budmar are out for the opener against Illinois State on August 31st. What is a recruiting violation now? You can give these guys as much money as you want. They have these QR codes on the back of helmets for Oklahoma State so you can donate to the collective. How can you possibly have a recruiting violation now? Here's the story, and this was first reported by The Athletic. There's very few details on this. McNamara committed to Iowa December 1st, 2022, just 3 days after entering the transfer portal as a graduate transfer. He started for Michigan in 2021 as the team won the Big Ten and reached the college football playoff, but had a season-ending leg injury in the third game of the 2022 season. That's when J.J. McCarthy took over. He has battled injuries through his time at Iowa, but opened the 2023 season as the starter. Ferentz announced in July last month that Ferentz was the team's starter, and that transfer Brendan Sullivan from Northwestern would be the backup. They had been competing for the job. Now, what could they have done to violate rules? What rules are there? There are no rules. You know, it used to be if you gave a player an inducement, oh my God, now you can promise them the moon. You know, so I really am baffled by a big-time program getting popped, and it's only a one-game suspension for one of those guarantee games. You know, Illinois State is guaranteed. They're being paid a lot of money to go lose at Iowa, which brings us to this really crazy story. Delaware State plays football in Delaware, obviously. They have scheduled, and it's going to happen, they're going to play in Hawaii. This is a team that went 1-10 last year. They're playing 5,000 miles away. Is that right? Something like that, right? It's Hawaii. I mean, what's going on here? Anyway, it's all about the guaranteed money, and the amount of money that they're being paid to go to Hawaii and play this game is significant for the athletic budget for a school the size of Delaware State. They're being paid $180,000 to do it, plus the hotels are being taken care of, and the air flight and the whole thing. So here they were, scheduled to fly out Tuesday, 2 days ago. But because there are no direct flights from the closest airports like Baltimore and Washington, they said, okay, let's do a direct flight from New York. There are direct flights from New York to Hawaii, but they had to hire a shuttle bus service to make that happen. And the problem was the shuttle bus service was not able to deliver them to New York in time for the flight. So they were kind of stuck in New York at the airport, not knowing what to do. There has now been resolution to this. The Delaware News Journal reported that the team's traveling party left yesterday morning, was expected to arrive in Hawaii last night. Although the team initially wanted to avoid connections, their trip Wednesday is now requiring 3 separate flights to do this. I mean, 3 separate flights to go 5,000 miles to lose a game. And that's what this is all about. They're going to lose to Hawaii, or, you know, if they don't lose, it'll be one of the big upsets of ever in college football. And it just highlights how crazy the world of college football is. Now, for just about any team, it's a schlep to get to Hawaii. But there are plenty of small West Coast teams that can make that flight, and it's a lot less. You know, you subtract 3,000 miles from the flight, and you could easily go direct. But nope, this is the way they do it. And on top of everything else, not that would have been Delaware State's fault if they didn't get there, but if either party committed a breach of contract, meaning either Hawaii or Delaware State, then the program would be due $750,000. Well, that's a hell of a lot of money for Delaware State. They weren't going to do that. But because the bus service couldn't get them there in time, it's called a force majeure event, which includes extenuating circumstances. But, you know, Delaware State was ranked 102 out of a possible 122 FCS programs, one of the worst teams in the country. But on top of everything else, they're having to schlep 5,000 miles to go to Hawaii. Hawaii wasn't very good last year. They're 5-8, but they ought to win this game by a few touchdowns. And they have won their last 20 games against opponents of this size. They used to call this Division I AA. They now call them FCS. The big ones are called FBS. But, man, I mean, it is incredible. And it's even worse than basketball. They do this in basketball, but the traveling party is small. You know, what do you have, 12, 13 guys on a college basketball team? You got probably 80 guys, something like that, 75, 80 players, plus the coaching staff and the whole traveling party, the trainers, the whole thing. You're probably talking about over 100 people, well over 100 people, making this flight 5,000 miles to go lose at Hawaii for $180,000. It's insane. It's just insanity, but that's the way college football works. 65 years ago today, the birth of the AFL. It's a fascinating story, and we'll get to it next.
The Andy Poland Show on ESPN 630, the sports capital.
Bram Weinstein now at 11. I'm sure he'll have some things to say about the kicking carousel in Ashburn, which hopefully has come to a stop. Riley Patterson, who missed 3 in the preseason, has been released, and they have made a deal with the Cleveland Browns to bring in Cade York, who was their kicker 2 years ago, lost his job in the preseason last year, didn't kick in the NFL last year, and has been in camp with them, but did not win the job this year with Dustin Hopkins coming back off a big year last year. So we'll see. If he's the answer, he's going to do the kicking against the New England Patriots on Sunday night, and maybe everybody can exhale with a veteran kicker who at least has done it. He was not spectacular as a rookie, made 75% of his kicks, which is no longer a big deal, excuse me, in the NFL. But he does have some experience, was a fourth-round pick of the Cleveland Browns and out of LSU. I don't think he intersected with Jaden Daniels, but he will be the kicker at least on Sunday night, and barring anything unforeseen, he will open the season as their kicker. And, boy, off-season of craziness because of the Brandon McManus situation where they had signed him as a free agent, and then it was later revealed that he was being sued in civil court because of alleged sexual harassment on a team flight last year to London. So we move on, and we move on to history. It was on this day in 1959 that it was announced there would be the American Football League. Da, 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 da. Now remember, the NFL had been around in 1959 for, almost 40 years. Started in 1920. They had the contract with CBS. They were not yet what baseball was. Baseball was still the number one sport in America, but football was starting to make inroads, and we had teams in big cities. And not all of them were doing particularly well. The Chicago Cardinals were struggling, and Lamar Hunt, who was a billionaire, part of a big Dallas family, was very interested in buying a football team and moving it to Dallas. There was no franchise in Dallas in 1959. That led him to the formation of the American Football League. And this is part of a feature that was done on the league, the AFL in color. And what you'll hear is Malcolm McCambridge, who wrote, I think, one of the best sports books ever written, the history of the National Football League. It's called America's Game, along with comments from the late Lamar Hunt about how the league got off the ground in 1959 into 1960.
Lamar Hunt wanted an NFL franchise, but the owners of the NFL told him the NFL wasn't going to expand. The only way he was going to get into the league was to buy a franchise. And the only franchise that was even considered to be for sale were the Chicago Cardinals. And he goes down to talk to the owner of the Cardinals in Miami, Walter Wolfner. And at one point, Wolfner boasted, look, Bud Adams down in Houston wants a team. There's people in Denver. There's people in Minneapolis. All these places want an NFL team. I don't need to deal with you. So Lamar Hunt shakes his hand, gets on a plane from Miami back to Dallas.
And then the thought occurred to me, and it was literally like a light bulb going off. Hey, if all of these people, me included, want to have teams in a new league or in pro football, why wouldn't a new league succeed? I asked myself that question, and then I thought, well, it will.
He gets some airline stationery and etches out the plans for this new league. This is how many teams, this is what the schedule's like, this is what the budget's going to be like. And then, typical of Lamar Hunt, he gets this great idea and tells nobody. And spends the next few months just very studiously, very carefully planning out how he's going to begin this new football league.
A new league was the least of the NFL's problems. Congress wanted NFL Commissioner Burt Bell to explain why his league should not be prosecuted as a monopoly. So when Bell learned of Hunt's plans, he decided it was time everyone knew about the budding American Football League.
And he asked if he could announce our league in these hearings. Now, he was doing it to get some heat off of himself. They were wanting to know, why isn't the NFL expanding? And so I said, well, sure, you go ahead and do that. And it got enormous attention because Burt Bell, in effect, announced that there was going to be a new league. Well, that was a lot better than having Lamar Hunt announce there was going to be a new league.
So how about that? So they initially had thoughts of teams in Dallas, New York, Houston, Denver, Los Angeles, and Minneapolis, St. Paul. That didn't actually happen for the AFL. Minnesota got a team in 1961 as an expansion team in the NFL, but they did wind up with 8 teams to get off the ground with the Boston Patriots, the Buffalo Bills, and the Oakland Raiders. And that's how the league launched in 1960. They had 8 teams. The NFL at the time had 14 teams. And that was your football. There were different networks. CBS had the NFL and NBC had the AFL. And they were off and running. And we've seen so many different leagues fold, but this one had some staying power. There was some, they called themselves, I think, the Idiots Club or something like that. They were nuts to go up against the NFL. But they stayed with it, and they made it work, and they made it work in a big way. And here we are 65 years later, and look at what the expansion of the league has meant, and the merger of the two leagues in 1970. They were basically killing each other in the late 60s as they were, bidding for draft picks. And I guess the biggest one would have been Joe Namath, who got this $400,000 plus contract from the Jets at a time where, first-round draft picks were signing for $50,000 or $60,000, and he really put that league on the map with the Super Bowl championship. We were just talking about Aaron Rodgers and what he wants to match in New York. Well, what Joe Namath did for the Jets in that Super Bowl really not just made him an iconic figure in the history of sports, but really put that league in solid footing. I mean, they already had the merger agreement in place, but, people wondered how much of a talent disparity is there going to be once there's a merger, because the Packers had, they hadn't blown them out, but they were lopsided games in the first 2 Super Bowls against Kansas City and Oakland. And what Joe Namath did was to say, wait a minute, we've got some really good players here, and we're capable of beating a team that many thought was unbeatable. 18-point favorites in that Super Bowl of 1969. This was the day, though, that they announced. It was on this day, August the 22nd of 1969, they announced the formation of the AFL. The NFL, which said, oh, no, we're not going to expand. We're not going to do that. They went ahead and they expanded, and they put a team in Dallas and they put a team in Minnesota, and the Cardinals relocated to St. Louis, and on and on and on. They had a commissioner, Joe Foss, who was a World War II fighter ace and former governor of South Dakota. He started as the first commissioner of the league, and Lamar Hunt was the president and often running the AFL, and it was announced on this day 65 years ago. One other thing to throw in here before we toss it over to Bram Weinstein, the nice little story here, and I can relate to this because I did 38 and a half years without a sick day, not in all the same place, moved to a lot of different stations, but there is a man by the name of Kevin Ford, and he was a cook at a Burger King at the Las Vegas airport. And after going 27 years without a sick day, they gave him something. And you'd think in Vegas they'd give him something really nice. No. Ford was handed a backpack with a movie ticket, a Starbucks cup, and a mix of candy and chocolate. 27 years without a sick day. Here's a cup, a movie ticket, and some candy. So his daughter, Serena, she wasn't too happy about that. So she started a GoFundMe page to show some love for the man that she says helped put his 4 daughters through high school and college because of his dedication to the chain. Now, he did have the health benefits and so forth, and he benefited from working for them, but he also gave them quite an effort and never called in sick. And so she hoped to raise $200. What she wound up raising was close to $500,000. Yeah. $459,000. So he's going to launch his own business. He's going to stay actually at Burger King, even with all that money raised. He's going to stay with the company till he reaches his 30th anniversary next year. But in the meantime, he's bought a food truck, which he's calling K27Y. That's his first initial, K, with 27 years off of that. Kevin, 27 years, K27Y, and that is a truck. And his daughter, who is a French trained chef at the Cordon Bleu, will begin making hamburgers and hot dogs in the food truck, and they're off and running. So, a nice story. Burger King, boy, I mean, they thought they were being generous with a Starbucks cup, chocolate, and a movie ticket. Who even goes to the movies anymore? Man, you'd think a big chain like that would give him something bigger than that. How about a week of vacation? Send him to the Bahamas. Heck, they're at the airport anyway. Just let him get off his shift at Burger King and jump on a plane to someplace nice. But okay, all's well that ends well. He raises close to $500,000 with a GoFundMe page, and he's off and running with a food truck. And you wish him the best of luck. So if you see that, K27Y, that is Kevin Ford's food truck, the Burger King cook who went 27 years without a sick day and was sort of rewarded by the company. All right, Bram is next, and I will see you back here tomorrow morning at 9 a.m.